My brothers and sisters in Christ, our reflections from the dialogue of St. Catherine of Siena, resumed today from The Way of Perfection, section 6. I would have you know that every virtue of yours and every vice is put into action by means of your neighbors. If you hate me, you harm your neighbors and yourself as well, for you are your chief neighbor, and the harm is both general and particular. I say general because it is your duty to love your neighbors as your own self. In love, you ought to help them spiritually with prayer and counsel, and assist them spiritually and materially in their need, at least with your good will if you have nothing else. If you do not love me, you do not love your neighbors, nor will you help those you do not love. But it is yourself you harm most, because you deprive yourself of grace, and you harm your neighbors by depriving them of the prayer and loving desires you should be offering to me on their behalf. Every help you give them ought to come from the affection you bear them for love of me. In the same way, every evil is done by means of your neighbors, for you cannot love them if you do not love me. This lack of charity for me and for your neighbors is the source of all evils, for if you are not doing good, you are necessarily doing evil. And to whom is this evil shown and done? First of all to yourself, and then to your neighbors. Not to me, for you cannot harm me, except insofar as I count whatever you do to them as done to me. You do yourself the harm of sin itself, depriving yourself of grace, and there is nothing worse you can do. You harm your neighbors by not giving them the pleasure of the love and charity you owe them, the love with which you ought to be helping them by offering me your prayer and holy desire on their behalf. Such is the general help that you ought to give every reasoning creature. More particular are the services done to those nearest you under your very eyes. Here you owe each other help in word and teaching and good example. Indeed, in every need of which you are aware, giving counsel as sincerely as you would to yourself, without selfishness. If you do not do this because you have no love for your neighbors, you do them special harm, and this as persistently as you refuse them the good you could do. How? In this way. Sin is both in the mind and in the act. You have already sinned in your mind when you have conceived a liking for sin and hatred for virtue. This is the fruit of that sensual selfishness which has driven out the loving charity you ought to have for me and your neighbors. And once you have conceived, you give birth to one sin after another against your neighbors, however it pleases your perverse sensual will. Sometimes we see cruelty, general or particular, born. It is a general sort of cruelty to see yourself and others damned and in danger of death for having lost grace. What cruelty to refuse to help either oneself or others by loving virtue and hating vice! But some actually extend their cruelty even further, not only refusing the good example of virtue, but in their wickedness assuming the role of the devil by dragging others as much as they can from virtue and leading them to vice. This is spiritual cruelty, to make oneself the instrument for depriving others of life and dealing out death. Bodily cruelty springs from greed, which not only refuses to share what is one's own, but takes what belongs to others, robbing the poor, playing the overlord, cheating, defrauding, putting up one's neighbor's goods, and often their very persons for ransom. O wretched cruelty, you will find yourself deprived of my mercy unless you turn to compassion and kindness. At times you give birth to hurtful words, followed often enough by murder. At other times you give birth to indecency toward others, and the sinner becomes a stinking beast, poisoning not only one or two, but anyone who might approach in love or fellowship. And who is hurt by the offspring of pride? Only your neighbors. For you harm them when your exalted opinion of yourself leads you to consider yourself superior, and therefore to despise them. And if pride is in a position of authority, it gives birth to injustice and cruelty, and becomes a dealer in human flesh. O dearest daughter, grieve that I am so offended, and weep over these dead so that your prayer may destroy their death. For you see that everywhere, on every level of society, all are giving birth to sin on their neighbors' heads. For there is no sin that does not touch others, whether secretly by refusing them what is due them, or openly by giving birth to the vices of which I have told you. It is true, then, that every sin committed against me is done by means of your neighbors. May God bless you all.